Bavaria, May 1945. Reich Marshal Hermann Göring, once the second most powerful man in Nazi Germany, stands at a roadside checkpoint near Radstadt, Austria. Around him, American soldiers stare not at a broken warlord, but at something almost theatrical. A powder blue Luftwaffe uniform adorned with medals, custom leather boots, and a jeweled baton. Behind him, trucks carry trunks filled with more uniforms, some never worn, each one a testament to vanity and power. Within hours, those uniforms would become some of the most sought-after trophies of World War II. Their journey from Göring's wardrobe to museums, private collections, and forgotten storage rooms reveals a strange epilogue to the Reich's collapse. Hermann Göring was many things during the Third Reich. Luftwaffe commander, Hitler's designated successor, and architect of the four-year plan that prepared Germany for war. But he was also something more unusual for a military leader, a man obsessed with appearance. Unlike other Nazi officials who favoured austere uniforms, Göring embraced extravagance. He commissioned tailors to create dozens of custom uniforms in colours and styles that had no basis in regulation. White dress uniforms for summer, grey-blue for ceremonies, and green hunting outfits adorned with gold braid became his signature. He wore different ensembles for different occasions, sometimes changing clothes multiple times a day. Photographs from the 1930s and the early 1940s show him in elaborate coats, custom-designed caps, and suits decorated with medals he had awarded himself. His vanity was so well known that even within the Nazi hierarchy it became a subject of mockery. Goebbels privately called him a dressed-up clown, and Hitler tolerated it as long as Göring remained useful. The scale of Göring's wardrobe was extraordinary. By 1945, he owned an estimated 100 to 200 uniforms, though exact records were never fully compiled. These were not simple military tunics. They included custom Luftwaffe field marshal uniforms in multiple shades of blue, ceremonial dress uniforms with hand-embroidered eagles, hunting outfits modelled after medieval German nobility, and specially designed coats featuring fur trim and jewelled buttons. Some uniforms were tailored in Vienna, others in Berlin by craftsmen who worked exclusively for high-ranking officials. Göring's tailor, a man named Hermann Schulze, reportedly kept detailed measurements and sketches of each design, though most of these records disappeared during the war's final months. Beyond uniforms, Göring collected accessories: silk-lined capes, leather gloves dyed to match specific outfits, custom-made boots from Italian shoemakers, and a collection of batons and swords that numbered in the dozens. Each item reflected a man who saw himself not merely as a military commander, but as a living symbol of prestige. His obsession extended to his homes. Hall, his estate north of Berlin, featured entire rooms dedicated to storing uniforms and regalia. Servants maintained an inventory, rotating outfits to prevent moth damage, and ensuring that each piece was cleaned and pressed. At Weldenstein Castle, his ancestral family home near Nuremberg, additional uniforms were stored in climate-controlled rooms. Even his hunting lodge at Romanten in East Prussia held racks of specialized hunting attire. Göring treated his wardrobe with the same care that collectors reserve for fine art. He supervised fittings personally, insisting on adjustments that might take weeks to complete. Buttons had to be positioned exactly, medals aligned with geometric precision, and fabrics chosen for their weight and drape. Those who worked with him described a man who could spend hours debating the shade of a collar or the placement of an eagle insignia. By early 1945, Göring's world was collapsing. The Luftwaffe, once a symbol of German air superiority, had been reduced to a scattered remnant. Allied bombers struck German cities with impunity, and Göring's influence within the Nazi leadership had evaporated. Hitler blamed him for the air war's failure, and Göring spent much of his time isolated at Hall or retreating to his estates. In April 1945, as Soviet forces closed in on Berlin, Göring made a fateful decision. He sent a telegram to Hitler suggesting that he take control of the Reich if Hitler became incapacitated. Hitler interpreted this as treason and ordered Göring's arrest. By late April, Göring was under house arrest at Obersalzberg, his staff reduced, his authority stripped. On May 4, 1945, as American forces advanced through Bavaria, Göring decided to surrender. He had spent the previous days packing. Among the items loaded into trucks were trunks filled with uniforms, cases of medals, and personal belongings that he hoped might secure favorable treatment. Goring surrendered to Brigadier General Robert Stack of the US 36th Infantry Division near the town of Radstadt, Austria. Accounts from American soldiers present describe a surreal scene. Goring arrived in a convoy of luxury cars, accompanied by staff, luggage, and his wife, Emmy. He wore a custom Luftwaffe uniform in pale blue, decorated with the Grand Cross of the Iron Cross and other medals. He carried a jeweled baton, and he behaved as though he were a visiting dignitary rather than a defeated enemy. American officers were initially uncertain how to respond. Some treated him with formal courtesy, while others viewed him with contempt. What caught everyone's attention, however, was the sheer volume of possessions he had brought. Soldiers opened trunks and found uniform after uniform, many still wrapped in tissue paper. There were dress tunics, field coats, ceremonial capes, hunting outfits, and accessories that seemed to belong in a theatre rather than a military headquarters. One soldier later described the discovery as like opening a costume shop for a madman. In the days following his surrender, Göring was taken to various interrogation centres, first in Augsburg and later at Mondorf-les-Bains in Luxembourg, a facility the Americans nicknamed Ashcan. His luggage followed him. US Army intelligence officers catalogued the contents, photographing items and compiling lists. Among the documented pieces were at least 20 complete Luftwaffe uniforms, including multiple versions of his Reich Marshal insignia. There were white summer dress uniforms, grey-blue winter coats, and green hunting suits with embroidered lapels. Accessories included custom leather boots, silk-lined gloves, fur-trimmed capes, and a collection of medals that filled several cases. Some uniforms had never been worn. Tags were still attached, fabrics uncreased. Others showed signs of frequent use, with wear around collars and cuffs. The sheer excess astonished American personnel, many of whom came from modest backgrounds and found Göring's wardrobe grotesque. Not everything was catalogued. American soldiers operating in the chaotic final weeks of the war took items as souvenirs. The practice was officially discouraged, but widely tolerated for lower-value objects. Göring's uniforms, however, represented high-value trophies. Soldiers who had access to his luggage pocketed medals, buttons, and smaller items. Some took photographs wearing his caps or holding his batons. A few managed to secure entire uniform pieces, which they mailed home or carried in duffel bags. These acts were rarely documented, and many items simply disappeared into private hands. Decades later, pieces of Göring's wardrobe would surface at estate sales, auctions, and military memorabilia shows, often with minimal provenance beyond a soldier's claim that it had been taken in 1945. The US Army retained the bulk of Göring's possessions for the Nuremberg trials, which began in November 1945. Göring was the highest-ranking Nazi official to stand trial, and his appearance mattered. American authorities wanted him presented as a defeated criminal, not a dignified leader. To achieve this, they confiscated his elaborate uniforms and provided him with a simple regulation Luftwaffe tunic, stripped of medals and insignia. Göring protested. He argued that his uniforms were personal property and that he had the right to appear in attire befitting his former rank. The court denied his requests. During the trial, he wore the plain grey-blue uniform, a stark contrast to the man who once changed outfits multiple times a day. Observers noted that without his regalia, Göring looked diminished, almost ordinary. The psychological impact was deliberate. By removing the symbols of power, the Allies aimed to strip away the aura that Göring had carefully cultivated for over a decade. Behind the scenes, the uniforms remained in Allied custody. The United States Army classified them as evidence and stored them in secure facilities near Nuremberg. Some were photographed for intelligence reports, with analysts noting the craftsmanship and materials used. The goal was partly historical, documenting the excesses of the Nazi elite, and partly practical. Understanding the supply chains that produced such custom goods provided insights into German wartime industry and the priorities of the regime. After Göring's conviction and subsequent suicide on October 15, 1946, questions arose about what to do with his possessions. Some officials argued for destruction, believing that preserving them risked creating relics for Nazi sympathizers. Others advocated for retention, viewing them as important historical artifacts. The debate mirrored broader discussions about how to handle Nazi memorabilia in the post-war period. Ultimately, no single decision governed the fate of Göring's uniforms. Some pieces were transferred to United States military museums. The United States Army Center of Military History in Washington, D.C. received several items, including a white summer uniform and a ceremonial cape. These were catalogued as part of a broader collection documenting World War II enemy leaders. The Smithsonian Institution acquired a few pieces for its national collections, though they were rarely displayed due to concerns about glorifying Nazi figures. Other items went to the National Archives, where they were stored alongside documents and photographs from the Nuremberg trials. These pieces remained largely inaccessible to the public, preserved for research purposes, but kept out of general view. Not all of Göring's uniforms stayed in the United States. In the late 1940s and early 1950s, some items were transferred to European museums as part of repatriation agreements. The Deutsches Historisches Museum in Berlin received a grey-blue field marshal's coat, which was later displayed in exhibitions on the Nazi period. The Imperial War Museum in London acquired a dress tunic and several medals, using them in displays about the Reich's leadership. These institutions faced ethical questions about how to present such objects. Displaying Göring's uniforms risked attracting neo-Nazis or individuals who romanticized the Third Reich. To counter this, museums contextualized the items with detailed explanations of Göring's crimes and the regime's atrocities. The goal was education, not celebration. Private collectors also acquired pieces of Göring's wardrobe, though the roots were often murky. In the 1950s and the 1960s, veterans began selling war souvenirs to supplement their incomes. Göring's items commanded high prices because of their rarity and notoriety. Auction houses in the United States and Europe handled sales, often marketing them as important historical artifacts. A hunting tunic sold in New York in 1963 fetched several $1,000s, a significant sum at the time. Medals and badges bearing Göring's insignia appeared in catalogues for military collectors, sometimes with dubious provenance. The lack of centralized records made authentication difficult, and forgeries entered the market. By the 1970s, distinguishing genuine pieces from replicas became a challenge, as skilled craftsmen produced convincing fakes to meet demand. Controversy followed these sales. Jewish organizations and Holocaust survivors objected to the commercialization of Nazi memorabilia, arguing that it trivialized the suffering caused by the regime. Some countries, including Germany and Austria, passed laws restricting the sale of Nazi items, though enforcement varied. In France, auctions of Nazi memorabilia were banned outright in the 1990s. Despite these restrictions, private trade continued, often moving online in the 2000s. Websites and forums dedicated to military collectibles became hubs for buying and selling Göring's uniforms and accessories. Prices escalated. A complete uniform sold in 2015 for over $50,000, while individual medals and badges commanded thousands of dollars. The buyers ranged from serious historians and museums to wealthy individuals with no clear interest in education. Remarkable pieces remained hidden for decades. In 1982, a storage locker in New York was opened after years of abandonment. Inside, workers found a trunk containing 2 of Göring's hunting outfits, complete with embroidered eagles and fur trim. The previous owner, a veteran who had served in Bavaria in 1945, had stored them after returning home and never mentioned them to his family. The discovery made headlines, and the items were eventually sold to a private collector. Similar stories emerged over the years. A dress tunic appeared in a German attic in 1995, wrapped in newspaper from 1946. A jeweled baton surfaced in Texas in 2003, brought back by a soldier who had been stationed at Mondorf-les-Bains. Each discovery added fragments to the scattered puzzle of Göring's wardrobe. Not all pieces survived intact. Some uniforms deteriorated because of improper storage. Moths, humidity, and time took their toll on fabrics that had been designed for display, not long-term preservation. Medals and badges corroded, especially those taken as souvenirs and stored in basements or attics without climate control. Leather items cracked, silk linings disintegrated, and embroidery faded. Conservators who later examined surviving pieces found evidence of neglect and damage. Restoring these items for museum display required careful work, and in some cases deterioration was too advanced to reverse. The fragility of the materials served as a reminder that even objects associated with immense power were vulnerable to the passage of time. In recent decades, the question of what to do with Göring's uniforms has evolved. Museums have become more willing to display them, provided they are framed within proper historical context. Exhibitions on Nazi Germany now routinely include personal effects of leaders to illustrate the regime's obsession with image and propaganda. Göring's uniforms serve this purpose well, offering tangible evidence of his vanity and the broader culture of spectacle that defined the Third Reich. Visitors often react with a mixture of fascination and revulsion, struck by the contrast between the craftsmanship and the crimes committed by the man who wore them. Educational programs use the uniforms to discuss themes of power, propaganda, and the human tendency to equate appearance with authority. The ethical debates have not disappeared. When an auction house in Munich attempted to sell a Göring uniform in 2019, protests erupted. Critics argued that such sales normalize Nazi symbols and provide financial incentives to preserve relics of a criminal regime. Supporters countered that private ownership helps ensure preservation and that banning sales drives trade underground. Germany's government intervened, purchasing the uniform to prevent it from entering private hands. The item now resides in a state archive, accessible to researchers but not displayed publicly. This case highlighted the ongoing tension between historical preservation and moral responsibility. Some pieces of Göring's wardrobe found unexpected homes. A ceremonial cape ended up in a theater company's costume collection in California, used in productions about World War II. The company donated it to a museum in the 1990s after learning its origins. A pair of custom boots was discovered in an antique shop in London and purchased by a film production company for use in a documentary. These secondary journeys reflect the chaotic dispersal of Göring's possessions and the varied ways that historical objects circulate through society. What began as symbols of authority became props, curiosities, and eventually artifacts to be studied and preserved. The story of Göring's uniforms also intersects with broader efforts to document and preserve Nazi-era materials. Archives in Germany, the United States, and Israel maintain collections of documents, photographs, and objects from the period. Göring's items are part of this larger project, contributing to a historical record that aims to prevent distortion and denial. Researchers use the uniforms to study topics ranging from textile production in wartime Germany to the psychology of authoritarian leaders. The materials, craftsmanship, and design choices offer insights into the Reich's priorities and the lengths to which it went to project power. Technology has added new dimensions to preservation efforts. High-resolution photography and three-dimensional scanning allow museums to create digital records of Göring's uniforms, capturing details that might fade over time. These digital archives ensure that even if physical items deteriorate, accurate representations survive for future study. Virtual exhibitions make the uniforms accessible to global audiences without the ethical concerns of physical display. Digital access expands research and education while reducing the risks associated with exhibiting fragile material. Institutions can present the objects in contexts that emphasize education while avoiding the spectacle that Göring himself cultivated. The balance remains delicate, but digital tools offer new possibilities for engaging with difficult histories. For collectors and historians, tracing the provenance of Göring's uniforms has become a specialized field. Researchers cross-reference inventories from 1945, compare photographs from the Nuremberg trials, and interview descendants of soldiers who served in Bavaria during the surrender. Each verified piece adds to the historical record, while each fake or unverified item highlights the challenges of authentication. The work requires expertise in textiles, military insignia, and wartime logistics, and it demands ethical judgment as every transaction and display carries implications for how society remembers the past. In recent years, some of the most significant discoveries have come from family estates. Children and grandchildren of World War II veterans, unaware of what their relatives had taken, find items while sorting through belongings. These discoveries often prompt difficult conversations about wartime conduct and the ethics of keeping such objects. Some families choose to donate the items to museums, viewing that as a way to ensure they serve educational purposes. Others sell them, believing that private ownership does not diminish historical value. A few decide to destroy the items, uncomfortable with preserving anything connected to the Nazi regime. Each choice reflects personal and cultural attitudes toward memory and responsibility. The uniforms themselves tell stories beyond Göring's personal vanity. The tailoring techniques reveal the state of German textile production during the war. The materials used, imported silks, fine wools, and specialized dyes, indicate supply chains that diverted resources from military needs to satisfy elite preferences. The insignia and decorations reflect the hierarchies and rituals that structured the Nazi state. Even deterioration patterns offer information about which pieces were worn frequently, which were stored carefully, and which suffered from neglect. For historians, these objects are not just relics of one man's excess, but windows into the functioning of an entire regime. Some scholars argue that focusing on Göring's uniforms risks trivializing the broader horrors of the Nazi period. They caution against allowing fascination with material culture to overshadow the suffering inflicted by the regime. Others counter that studying the symbols and rituals of power is essential to understanding how such systems function and persist. Göring's obsession with appearance was not mere personal vanity, it was part of a calculated strategy to project authority and legitimacy. By examining the uniforms, researchers can trace how the Nazis used spectacle to manipulate public perception and consolidate control. The debate reflects broader tensions within historical scholarship about what deserves attention and how to balance different forms of evidence. For the general public, Göring's uniforms often evoke complex reactions. Museum visitors express surprise at the level of detail and craftsmanship, then discomfort at finding anything impressive about objects linked to such a figure. This tension is precisely what makes the uniforms valuable educational tools. They force viewers to confront the reality that the Nazi regime was not composed entirely of thugs and incompetents, but included individuals who understood power, aesthetics, and propaganda. Göring's uniforms embody this contradiction, beautiful objects created for monstrous purposes. Processing that contradiction is part of the work of historical education. The geographical spread of Göring's uniforms mirrors the global nature of World War II and its aftermath. Pieces reside on multiple continents, in countries that were allies, enemies, and neutral parties during the war. Each location adds layers of meaning. A uniform in a museum in Washington, D.C. speaks to American victory and the role of the United States in defeating Nazi Germany. A tunic in Berlin carries the weight of German memory and the ongoing struggle to confront the past. A medal in a private collection in Australia reflects the personal connections that bind distant places to global conflicts. Together, these scattered pieces form a map of memory, shaped by politics, commerce, and chance. Some of the most poignant stories involve items that were never meant to survive. A uniform coat worn by Goring during a 1938 state visit to Italy was supposed to be destroyed after the Nuremberg trials. Instead, it was stored in a military depot and rediscovered in the 1970s. By then, its survival seemed almost accidental, a bureaucratic oversight that preserved a piece of history. Similarly, a hunting outfit that should have been incinerated along with other Nazi regalia was saved by a junior officer who disobeyed orders, believing it had historical value. These acts of preservation, whether deliberate or accidental, shaped what survives and what is lost. The cultural impact of Göring's uniforms extends beyond museums and collections. They appear in films, documentaries, and television programs about World War II, often used to signify Nazi power and excess. Costume designers study photographs of Göring to create accurate replicas for historical dramas. This secondary life in popular culture ensures that his image remains part of public consciousness, though often divorced from the historical reality. The uniforms become symbols, shorthand for a regime and an era, reduced to visual cues that audiences recognize instantly. Whether this serves education or perpetuates shallow understanding remains an open question. The auction market for Göring's items has become increasingly controversial. In 2022, an online auction in the United States featured a tunic claimed to be from Göring's wardrobe. Protests from Jewish advocacy groups led the platform to cancel the sale. The incident sparked debates about free speech, historical preservation, and the responsibilities of commercial entities. Some argued that allowing such sales is consistent with democratic values and the principles of open inquiry. Others maintained that certain objects are too dangerous to commodify, their potential to inspire hatred outweighing any historical benefit. The arguments echoed earlier controversies and suggested that consensus on these issues remains elusive. Despite the debates, scholarly interest in Göring's uniforms continues to grow. Researchers in fashion history, material culture studies, and military history have published articles and books examining them. These studies explore questions about masculinity, power, and the construction of identity through clothing. Goring's wardrobe becomes a case study in how authoritarian leaders use appearance to project strength and legitimacy. The uniforms also offer insights into the aesthetics of fascism, a topic that remains relevant as historians and political scientists analyze contemporary movements. Understanding how symbols and rituals function in authoritarian contexts has implications beyond the study of the past. Conservation efforts face ongoing challenges. Many of the surviving uniforms require climate-controlled environments to prevent further deterioration. Museums must balance the desire to display these objects with the need to preserve them for future generations. Some institutions rotate items in and out of storage, limiting exposure to light and environmental fluctuations. Others have invested in specialized display cases that filter ultraviolet light and maintain stable humidity levels. The cost of preservation is significant, and museums must weigh it against other priorities. In some cases, items have been deaccessioned or loaned to better equipped institutions, a pragmatic acknowledgement that preservation requires resources and expertise. The role of Goring's uniforms in Holocaust education is particularly sensitive. Educators must present them in ways that honor the memory of victims while providing historical context. Some Holocaust museums include Nazi regalia in their exhibitions, using it to illustrate the machinery of oppression and the individuals who operated it. Others avoid such displays, focusing instead on the experiences of survivors and those murdered. When Goring's uniforms are included, they are typically accompanied by extensive interpretive materials that explain his role in establishing concentration camps, organizing the Gestapo, and implementing policies that led to genocide. The goal is to ensure that visitors understand these are not neutral objects, but artifacts of immense moral weight. Public opinion about displaying Goring's uniforms has shifted over time. In the immediate post-war period, there was reluctance to exhibit anything associated with Nazi leaders, fearing it might inspire sympathy or nostalgia. By the 1970s and the 1980s, as the generation that lived through the war began to pass, museums became more willing to include such items in historical exhibitions. Today, debates continue, but there is broader acceptance that difficult objects can serve educational purposes when presented thoughtfully. This evolution reflects changing attitudes toward memory, education, and the responsibilities of cultural institutions. Private collectors face unique challenges. Owning a piece of Goring's wardrobe carries legal, ethical, and social implications. In some countries, possession of Nazi items is illegal without proper permits. In others, it is legal but socially stigmatized. Collectors must navigate these complexities, often maintaining low profiles to avoid controversy. Some view their collections as acts of preservation, arguing that private ownership protects items from government seizure or destruction. Critics counter that private collections lack the educational framing that museums provide, potentially allowing objects to be appreciated aesthetically without moral context. The tension between private rights and public responsibility remains unresolved. The digital age has transformed access to information about Goring's uniforms. Online databases, digitized archives, and virtual exhibitions make it possible for anyone with an internet connection to view and study these objects. This democratization of access has benefits and risks. On one hand, it enables global education and research, breaking down geographical barriers. On the other hand, it allows for the spread of misinformation and the glorification of Nazi symbols by extremist groups. Platforms hosting images of Goring's uniforms must implement policies to prevent misuse while preserving legitimate historical inquiry. Striking this balance is an ongoing challenge in an era of rapid information dissemination. Some of the most intriguing pieces remain unaccounted for. Inventories from 1945 list items that have never surfaced in museums or auctions. A ceremonial sword with a jeweled hilt mentioned in multiple documents has never been found. A white summer uniform described by American officers as the most elaborate ever seen disappeared after the Nuremberg trials and has not reappeared. These missing pieces fuel speculation and occasional rumors. Every few years, claims emerge that someone has discovered a lost uniform, but authentication usually proves impossible. The gaps in the historical record remind us that many objects from the war are simply gone, their stories ending in obscurity or destruction. The legacy of Goring's uniforms extends beyond the physical objects. They symbolize the excesses of totalitarianism and the ways that leaders use personal presentation to consolidate power. Goring's obsession with appearance was extreme, but it was not unique. Throughout history, authoritarian figures have understood the importance of visual spectacle in shaping public perception. By studying Göring's wardrobe, we gain insights into these broader patterns. The uniforms become teaching tools, illustrating how symbols and rituals function in political systems. They remind us that power is not only exercised through violence and coercion, but also through performance and display. For veterans and their families, Göring's uniforms evoke memories of a defining moment in history. Some veterans who encountered Göring in 1945 described feeling a mixture of contempt and fascination. They recognized him as a criminal, yet his presence carried a certain weight, shaped in part by the visual symbols he cultivated. Decades later, those veterans would recount their experiences, often focusing on the contrast between Göring's elaborate dress and the destruction he helped create. These personal testimonies add human dimensions to the story, grounding it in lived experience rather than abstract historical analysis. The future of Göring's uniforms remains uncertain. As museums evolve and public attitudes shift, decisions about their display and preservation will continue to change. Some institutions may choose to retire them from public view, focusing instead on other aspects of World War II history. Others may integrate them into broader narratives about the uses and abuses of power. Technology will likely play a larger role, with virtual reality and augmented reality offering new ways to engage with difficult objects. Whatever the future holds, the uniforms will remain a part of the historical record, tangible reminders of a regime that sought to dominate through spectacle as much as through force. In the end, the story of Hermann Göring's uniforms is a story about memory, power, and the objects that survive us. From the chaotic days of May 1945, when American soldiers opened trunks filled with elaborate costumes, to the museums and private collections where they reside today, these uniforms have traveled a path shaped by chance, choice, and controversy. They are not mere clothes, but artifacts laden with meaning, each one a chapter in the larger history of the 20th century. What they reveal is uncomfortable, that the architects of atrocity were not always easily recognizable monsters, but individuals who understood symbolism, aesthetics, and the performance of authority. Göring's obsession with appearance was a mask, one that he wore until the very end. Today, those masks rest in glass cases and climate-controlled vaults remind us that the past is never truly past, and that the objects we leave behind tell stories we cannot fully control. If you found this video insightful, watch What Happened to the Führer Bunker after World War II next. It is a deep look at how Hitler's final refuge was concealed, rediscovered, and gradually erased from Berlin's landscape. Like this video, subscribe and hit the bell for more history. Thanks for watching.